Dusk fell over the village, casting long, unsettling shadows that seemed to whisper forgotten secrets. Father Miguel, a retired priest, lived as a recluse in an old house on the edge of the village, an existence marked by solitude and silence. His eyes, tired and deep, carried a weight that couldn't be seen, but could certainly be felt. As the night wore on, a distant bell began to ring, and Miguel, sitting in an antique armchair, looked at a dusty reliquary on the table. It was an artifact of the past, a reminder of the days when his life was steeped in sacred rituals and exorcisms, but now, the reliquary seemed more like an anchor for his nightmares than a source of comfort. The phone rang, interrupting the silence with a sharp, unexpected sound. Miguel hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was tense, almost desperate. "Father Miguel, we need you. There is something wrong with the village." The voice trembled with fear, but Miguel was already familiar with this type of fear. He knew it wasn't just a distress call. Something was rising from the shadows, something he had seen before and would rather have left behind. The phone clicked off, and Miguel stood up with a weight on his chest. The village he had tried to forget was now calling him back, but what he would find there could be more than a simple emergency. It could be a manifestation of his own deepest fears, proof that the demons he thought he had buried were ready to rise again. He dressed quickly, grabbed his old coat, and with a heavy sigh prepared to face not only the village, but the horrors that had driven him to abandon his calling. The night was about to reveal its secrets, and Miguel knew that what was to come might finally force him to confront what really happened in his life and in the furthest reaches of his soul. The sun was setting when Father Michael arrived at the Vatican office in Rome, an imposing building that seemed to hide more secrets than the clergy themselves could comprehend. The meeting was scheduled with a high-ranking cardinal, a man who, for many years, had been his superior and mentor. Miguel entered, his hopes almost invisible given the weight of the news he was carrying. The cardinal, with a stern expression and a gaze that seemed to pierce through Miguel, was waiting for him in an austere room, adorned only with ancient tapestries and statues of saints. "Father Miguel," began the cardinal, "what do you have to say about the recent incidents in your parish?" The voice was cold and unforgiving. Miguel hesitated, feeling the weight of his words. "Oh, it's not just the parish, Your Eminence. The events are extraordinary. I have witnessed phenomena that defy rational explanation. I requested permission to perform exorcisms, but permission was denied." The cardinal stood up, walking slowly to a window that overlooked the inner courtyard. "We are aware of your concerns, Father. However, exorcisms are a practice that must be carried out with extreme caution. The Church cannot allow any priest to perform these rituals without strict verification. You must understand that the Church has a responsibility to truth and order." Miguel felt a growing frustration. "But, Eminence, what is happening cannot be ignored. There are forces beyond human understanding involved. If we don't act, more lives could be lost." The cardinal turned to him, his eyes like sharp blades. "Your faith must not cloud judgment, Father. There is not enough evidence to justify intervention. Stay within established limits." The shock on Miguel's expression was evident. He was being prohibited from acting, even in the face of what he believed to be a real and imminent threat. With a heavy heart and a turbulent mind, he left the office, feeling the heavy sense of betrayal and helplessness. With every step he took in the Vatican corridor, the cardinal's decision seemed like a threatening echo, as if it were a condemnation of his sense of duty and justice. As the weeks passed, the village where Father Miguel had taken refuge began to experience a series of disturbing events that defied logic and reason. The once calm atmosphere became somber and filled with a palpable sense of despair. The first occurrences were small, almost insignificant. Dead animals were found on roads, their bodies in grotesque, deformed states, as if an invisible force had manipulated them. Crops which had previously flourished vibrantly and healthily began to wither and rot, with no apparent explanation. The soil that had supported life now seemed cursed, unable to nourish anything that was grown. The people of the village began to exhibit strange and disturbing behaviors. Former residents, once friendly and welcoming, became aggressive and inhumane, involved in violent arguments and acts of desperation. The feeling of dread and distrust hung in the air, like a dark cloud that enveloped every aspect of everyday life. Miguel watched all this with a growing sense of anguish. He walked through the silent streets, noticing the closed windows and locked doors. The normally playful children were now scared and withdrawn. Life in the village seemed to have been sucked out, leaving only a shell of fear and desolation. His own home, which had been a refuge, was beginning to feel the weight of the phenomena. He heard inexplicable noises during the night, Indistinct whispers, knocks on the walls, and a cold that seemed to emanate from the depths of hell. When he tried to sleep, visions of distorted faces and empty eyes invaded his dreams, causing him to wake up in a cold sweat. The village, once serene and peaceful, was now plunged into a state of chaos, and Miguel knew that something evil was infiltrating people's lives. He felt that the village was at the center of a supernatural storm, and that, although he tried to ignore it, it was inevitably linked to the events he had witnessed before. Time was running out, and he needed to act before the evil rising from the shadows consumed everything. Julio was a young man of 19 who had always been like a son to Father Miguel. Since Julio's mother, a longtime friend of Miguel's, had passed away, he had taken him in and raised him as his own. The bond between the two was deep, a bond formed not just by religion, but by the need for comfort and support in difficult times. Miguel's house was silent, except for the sound of the wind that passed through the cracks in the old windows. Julio was sitting in the living room, staring at a spot on the floor. The expression on the young man's face was distant, almost as if he was struggling to maintain the reality around him. Miguel watched him with growing concern, noticing changes in his behavior. "Did something happen, Julio?" Miguel asked, trying to break the silence. Julio looked up, but didn't respond immediately. The young man's hesitation was palpable. It's like something is happening here. "Something I can't explain," Julio finally said, his voice shaking a little. "I feel a strange presence. And the others in the village? They feel it too. I heard things strange and scary." Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of things, Julio? Tell me exactly what you heard." Julius hesitated, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. Voices in the night. Murmurs that I can't distinguish, but that make me feel deep fear, and there is something more, things disappearing. People changing, everything is becoming strange. Miguel got up and started pacing the room, his thoughts racing quickly. Julio's description coincided with what he had heard from other sources before withdrawing. He approached Julio and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You must tell me if there is anything else, anything that seems out of the ordinary. We need to understand what is happening." Julio looked at Miguel with a mixture of fear and confidence. "I've been feeling a connection to something I can't explain, and I feel like this could be related to what's happening in the village." Miguel frowned, his heart heavy with worry and the growing fear that Julio might be more involved than he let on. Julio's presence, the feeling of change and the growing sense of threat began to form a dark picture in Miguel's mind. The sun was low on the horizon as the village prepared for Sunday Mass. The church bell began to ring, echoing through the stone houses and dusty fields. Father Miguel, already dressed in his priestly robes, was preparing for the sermon that he hoped would bring some hope to the community in crisis. The congregation was gathered together, a mix of worried and hopeful faces. However, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The village was in shambles, and the feeling of immense evil hung in the air. Miguel felt the weight of responsibility and doubt with every step he took. During the sermon, a woman rushed through the church door, interrupting the flow of Miguel's words. His eyes were wide, and his voice, when he spoke, was thick with panic. "Father Miguel, you are responsible for this. It's your fault." Miguel looked surprised, feeling a mixture of confusion and horror. "Please calm down." "What do you mean by that?" The woman, whose hair was disheveled and her face was pale, advanced towards the altar. His eyes were glassy, and a guttural voice began to come out of his mouth as if it were someone else's. "Evil is here because of you. You brought destruction to this place." The congregation was in shock, whispers of fear and despair spreading like wildfire. Miguel tried to speak, but his words were interrupted by a sharp scream that made everyone's heart stop. The woman began to convulse and suddenly fell to the ground, her breathing becoming irregular. Fear spread among those present, and a murmur of panic formed. Miguel knelt down next to the woman, trying to help her, but in vain. His eyes turned to his last expression, a look of absolute terror. The woman died there in front of everyone in circumstances that seemed to defy logical explanation. The village was now in a state of complete shock. The accusation she made and the horrific way she died added a layer of mystery and terror to the situation. Miguel knew that the woman's death and her words would deeply impact the community, intensifying the crisis they were already facing. With a heavy heart and a shaken spirit, Miguel faced a situation in which fear and guilt were intertwined, and the shadows of the truth seemed thicker than ever. The nights in Villa Esperanza had become increasingly restless. An atmosphere of despair hung over the small community, and residents could not ignore the growing feeling that something evil was at work. Dread was palpable around every corner, and the village seemed to be sinking into an abyss of darkness. Miguel was back in his small home, where he tried to maintain a semblance of normality. But as the night wore on, he heard rumblings and whispers coming from outside. He looked out the window and saw wooden crosses in burned gardens, their shapes distorted and charred. Symbols of faith, which were once symbols of protection, were now signs of growing evil. In the village's central square, where children used to play, there were now strange and disturbing symbols drawn on the ground. Residents were in a state of panic, and many houses were locked, with people hiding in their own fears. The market, which used to be a place of conversation and laughter, was deserted. The shops closed in a hurry. The crops around the village were rotting, and a foul smell of decay hung in the air, mixed with a strange, pungent aroma that no one could identify. Miguel went to one of the few houses still open. Inside, a woman named Clara was crying, her hands shaking as she held a Bible. "Father, I don't know what's going on. It feels like something has taken over us. The children won't stop crying and we're seeing things. Things that shouldn't exist." Miguel tried to calm her down, but his own panic was growing. The evil seemed to have taken a concrete form, and the intensity of the events only increased. He spent the night investigating the affected areas, trying to understand the extent of the evil presence. Every step he took into the village seemed to reveal more of the true face of the terror that was spreading like a dark ink blot. As he walked through the forest near the village, Miguel felt a chilling presence. The trees seemed to whisper and the branches moved in an unsettling way. It was as if nature itself was being corrupted by the force that was dominating the village. Rosa, a woman with gray hair and a desperate look, stood at the door of her small house. His face was marked by exhaustion and anguish, and his eyes seemed to ask for help. The tension in her body was evident as she prepared to face Father Miguel. Miguel was examining one of the strange symbols when Rosa found it, her heart pounding. She approached him urgently, her words coming out in a whirlwind of desperation. "Father Miguel, please, I need your help. My son Pedro is changed. He's possessed, and I don't know what to do. The doctors can't help, and no one believes me anymore." Miguel felt a wave of sadness and concern upon hearing his story. "Rosa, I understand how difficult this must be for you. But you know that without the Vatican's permission, I cannot perform an exorcism. We need concrete evidence to justify this type of action." Rosa interrupted him, her tone filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "I don't care about permissions or rules. My son is hurting, and I see something in his eyes that isn't his. I can't wait any longer. I know you have knowledge about these things. Please help me. I'm desperate." Rosa's appeal hit Miguel deeply. He knew that if he didn't act, it might be too late for Pedro in the village. Rosa's fear and anguish were palpable, and Miguel knew that the decision he made could have irreversible consequences. Despite his own doubts and the Vatican's ban, the situation seemed to demand immediate action. He prepared himself for the task that he knew would be dangerous and controversial, but he also knew he could not ignore the suffering of a desperate mother. The night was about to become even darker, and Miguel was on the verge of crossing a line that could define the fate of the village and his own faith. The night was particularly cold and silent when Rosa, a desperate mother, knocked on Father Miguel's door. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her hands were shaking as she held a small Bible. She was clearly panicking, and Miguel could feel the depth of her despair. "Father Miguel, please, you need to help me," Rosa pleaded, her voice a mix of desperation and hopelessness. "My son Daniel he's changing. It's not him anymore. Something took over him. I've heard rumors that you can help. Even without the church's permission, I know you can." Miguel, surprised by the request, led Rosa to the living room. "Calm down, Rosa. Let's try to understand what is happening. Tell me more about Daniel." Rosa sat on the edge of the couch, tears streaming down her face as she tried to speak. He was a sweet, obedient boy. "For weeks ago, he started acting strangely. He has nightmares, talks to himself in a language I don't know. And now he's not my son anymore. He has a strength I can't explain, and his eyes are different." Miguel felt a chill run down his spine when he heard the description. He knew that this was not a simple psychological problem. It was something much deeper and more disturbing. "Where is Daniel now?" "He's in the room," replied Rosa, her voice barely audible. "I can't go there. I'm afraid of what might happen. Please do something." Miguel headed to Daniel's room, the atmosphere in the house weighing on his shoulders like an invisible burden. When he opened the bedroom door, he found a disturbing scene. The boy, with his dark and empty eyes, was lying on the bed, his limbs stretched out in an unnatural way. He murmured in an unknown language, his voice a distorted and sinister whisper. Miguel approached cautiously, trying to assess the situation. He felt an ominous presence in the air, a force that seemed to be sucking the light out of the room. The environment was charged with a sense of evil, and Miguel knew that what was before him was something that transcended any rational explanation. With an expression of determination, Miguel prepared for what would be an impromptu exorcism. Aware that he was directly defying Vatican orders, he prayed in a low voice, his words of faith fighting against the darkness that seemed to envelop the room. The room was plunged into an almost palpable gloom as Miguel began to recite the exorcism prayers. The sound of his voice seemed almost like an illusion of normality amidst the growing chaos. Daniel, on the bed, writhed and made a guttural sound that was not human. The surrounding environment seemed to respond to the struggle between light and dark, with shadows that danced on the walls and an oppressive feeling that made the air almost unbreathable. Miguel held a silver cross tightly, his eyes fixed on the possessed boy. "In the name of Christ, I command you to depart from this body," he proclaimed, trying to convey an authority that, deep down, he wasn't entirely sure he possessed. The words of exorcism flowed from his lips, but the result seemed almost insignificant compared to the resistance of the entity that controlled Daniel. Daniel stood up suddenly, his eyes now completely black, and gave him a look that seemed to pierce Miguel's soul. "You are weak, Father." The boy's voice spoke with a cold, menacing intensity. "You can't save anyone. You are in our house now." Miguel felt a deep chill. Daniel's demonic behavior was intensifying. The boy convulsed violently. The force of his almost physical presence seemed to push Miguel back. The murmurs that came out of Daniel's mouth became louder, and Miguel saw terrifying visions, distorted images of faces and creatures that did not belong to this world. Desperate, Miguel tried to intensify his prayer, his voice now a cry of faith in the midst of despair. But the exorcism was falling apart. The entity seemed stronger than he had imagined, and the feeling of failure was overwhelming. The ritual was turning into chaos, and Miguel knew he needed to find another way to face the evil that lay before him. The room was immersed in dense gloom, with only the faint light of candles casting dancing shadows on the walls. Miguel, dressed in priestly robes, prepared for the exorcism ritual with a heavy heart and tumultuous mind. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and a palpable fear seemed to hang in the air, enveloping him in an aura of unrest. Daniel lay on the bed, his deep black eyes watching Miguel with a gaze that seemed to pierce the priest's very soul. The boy waved his arms erratically, as if an invisible force was controlling him. The constant murmur in a language Miguel didn't understand created an almost hypnotic and disturbing sound. Miguel began the ritual, reciting prayers in Latin in a firm, authoritative voice. He sprinkled holy water around the room and made the sign of the cross, trying to invoke divine protection against the entity that had taken possession of the boy. The air was cold and the feeling of oppression increased as he continued in prayer. As Michael spoke the sacred words, Daniel's reaction became increasingly frantic. The boy writhed and writhed on the bed, his body moving unnaturally. Their screams and moans mixed with the murmurs, creating a sound that seemed to be challenging Miguel's own sanity. He felt an almost physical resistance, as if the evil force was fighting the intervention. In a particularly terrifying moment, Daniel rose from the bed with superhuman strength and began taunting Miguel. His voice, now distorted and grotesque, echoed throughout the room. "Do you think you can kick me out? I'm older than you, Father. What are you going to do? Pray for me to go away?" Miguel struggled to maintain control, his hands shaking as he held the crucifix and continued the ritual. The tension in the room increased, and a feeling of despair came over Miguel as he realized that his words and actions were not having the desired effect. The ritual was failing, and the entity seemed to have more power than he imagined. With sweat running down his forehead and fatigue weighing on his shoulders, Miguel made one last attempt, raising his voice in a desperate prayer. But the feeling of failure was inescapable, and the weight of the evil that enveloped Daniel seemed insurmountable. After the failed ritual, Miguel was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He left Daniel's room, his mind buzzing with tumultuous thoughts and an overwhelming feeling of defeat. The darkness of the village seemed to have infiltrated his soul, and the weight of the exorcism's failure was crushing. He walked through the house, his legs heavy and his mind burdened with doubts and questions. The silence that had once been calming now felt oppressive, and each step seemed to echo the sound of his own internal crisis. Miguel sat in the armchair in his living room, his eyes fixed on a crucifix that hung on the wall. The symbol of his faith, which had once brought him comfort, now seemed a cruel reminder of his powerlessness. Looking at the crucifix, Miguel felt a wave of doubt that shook him deeply. He had dedicated his life to serving the church, believing that his faith and practices could confront evil. But failure in the face of such a powerful and terrifying entity made him question whether everything he had believed was right. The entity's words, mocking his exorcism attempt, echoed in his mind. "What are you going to do? Pray for me to go away." Those words became a piercing cry of doubt and despair. Miguel wondered if the faith and practices he had followed were not enough, if the church had failed to prepare him to face true evil. Feeling lost and abandoned, Miguel got up and started walking around the house, trying to shake off the weight of his crisis of faith. Every corner seemed to remind him of his flaws and the words of the entity. The darkness in the village had reflected itself in his own soul, and he was on the verge of losing not only the battle against evil, but also the very belief that sustained his life. He knew he needed to make a decision, find a new path, or lose himself completely in the darkness that now seemed to consume everything around him. After the exorcism failed, Father Miguel found himself in the shadow of his own crisis of faith. The dawn dragged on, and the piercing cold of the night seemed to reflect the emptiness and desolation in his heart. Sitting at the small table in his home, Miguel looked at the crucifix in his hand with a feeling of doubt and despair that he had never experienced before. The ritual that was supposed to be an act of purification and hope turned into an uncontrollable nightmare. Daniel's behavior, the demonic words that mocked his faith, and the helplessness he felt in the face of the evil entity left Miguel with a deep feeling of failure and frustration. He had placed all his trust in the traditions and teachings of the church, but now he found himself confronted with a force that seemed to ignore any attempt at control. Miguel walked through the house, his steps heavy and uncertain. He stopped in front of a bookshelf where he kept old books on theology and exorcisms. His eyes roamed the worn covers, and he wondered if the answers he was looking for were there, hidden between the dusty pages. However, a growing sense of disillusionment overcame him. The words that were once certainties now seemed like empty echoes. In a moment of vulnerability, Miguel knelt and prayed, not with the certainty and strength he used to have, but with a humility that reflected his inner crisis. "Lord," he pleaded, his voice low and trembling, "where is your help? I'm lost, and I don't know how to face the evil that plagues us. Please give me direction, show me the way." Doubt took over every thought. He felt his purpose was in question, that his faith was being tested to its limits. The church had abandoned him, and the rituals he believed to be powerful tools now seemed ineffective. The feeling of being alone against a cosmic and implacable force consumed him, and Miguel didn't know if he could continue without the certainty of his belief. This crisis of faith was not just a personal dilemma. It was an existential struggle that threatened to dismantle everything he had known and believed in. As the night progressed and the cold deepened, Miguel found himself on the threshold of a crucial decision that could redefine his destiny and that of everyone around him. As Miguel faced his crisis of faith, the village of Villa Esperanza descended increasingly into chaos. The feeling of hopelessness was visible around every corner. The community, once united and peaceful, was now torn apart by the presence of an evil that seemed to consume everything in its path. The residents, already exhausted by the constant feeling of fear, had begun to accuse each other of being responsible for the supernatural events that were plaguing the village. Old feuds and disagreements were exacerbated by growing paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, and the slightest sound was interpreted as a sign that something terrible was about to happen. In the central square, a group of residents gathered, frantically debating what to do. The discussion was filled with fear and anger, and accusations flew like sharp arrows. "Someone here is involved with the devil. It must be the only explanation for what is happening," shouted a man, his voice full of panic. Meanwhile, at home, Clara, the woman who had previously sought out Miguel, was in a state of constant agitation. His son, who had been possessed, had gotten worse, and the pain of seeing him suffer was unbearable. She desperately tried to find a solution, but her attempts to seek help outside the village were unsuccessful. The supernatural events intensified. The few places still open were now covered in strange and disturbing symbols, and crucifixes, which had once been symbols of protection, were falling and breaking of their own accord. The fear was palpable, and confidence in safety and security had been completely destroyed. The atmosphere was filled with almost unbearable tension. Desperation and anguish hovered over every house, every street, and every person. The feeling that something evil was spreading, and that salvation was out of reach, was almost overwhelming. The community, on the verge of collapse, looked to Miguel, the last bastion of hope, with desperate expectation. But with his faith shaken and his abilities questioned, he was fighting not just evil, but the very hope that he could make a difference. The following days were marked by a growing sense of panic and despair in Villa Esperanza. Evil seemed to spread like a disease, and the atmosphere carried a palpable tension. Father Miguel, now in a state of desperate determination, began to delve deeper into the village's past in search of answers. He needed to understand the origin of the evil that was ravaging the community and perhaps find a way to combat it. Miguel visited the local library, an ancient building that seemed to hide secrets in its stone walls. The library was almost empty, except for an elderly librarian who was watching him with an expression of curiosity and concern. Miguel searched the historical archives and found old documents about the founding of the village. Many of the records were faded and difficult to read, but a few accounts captured his attention. He discovered a manuscript from an ancient chronicler of the village, dating back centuries, that mentioned a dark entity that had been worshipped by a secret cult. The writings spoke of dark sacrifices and rituals performed on an ancient altar that had been forgotten over time. The name of the cult was the Children of the Night, and its practices involved pacts with demonic forces in exchange for power and immortality. Miguel was shocked by the discovery. He began to make connections between current events and the practices described in the manuscript. The corruption of the land, the signs of possession, and the strange phenomena in the village were starting to make sense. The evil that now haunted Villa Esperanza could be rooted in ancient and forgotten practices that had been reactivated. With this new understanding, Miguel realized that to confront evil, he needed to not only fight the present, but also understand and confront the past. He began gathering information about the cult, trying to find out if there was any way to dismantle the influence that still hung over the village. The discoveries made by Miguel led him to an inevitable confrontation with the forces that had taken over the town. With the knowledge gained about ancient rituals, he prepared for a final confrontation with the entity that had been summoned by the Children of the Night. The battle that would follow would not only be against physical evil, but also against the shadows that haunted his own faith. On the night of the confrontation, Miguel gathered the few courageous residents who still believed in the possibility of salvation. They prepared to perform a ritual that, according to ancient texts, could finally banish the evil entity back to the depths from which it had emerged. The sky was cloudy and the wind was blowing with an almost supernatural force, increasing tension and fear. As the rituals and prayers were performed, the entity manifested itself with renewed fury. The battle was intense and harrowing, with Miguel and the residents fighting against forces that seemed impossible to control. At the height of the ritual, Miguel used the knowledge acquired about the ancient cult to direct the power of prayers and sacred symbols against the entity. Finally, after a grueling fight, the evil presence began to weaken and disappear. The morning light began to illuminate the village, bringing a sense of relief and hope. Evil had been banished, and Villa Esperanza could begin to heal from the scars left by recent events. Father Miguel, exhausted and scarred by the experience, knew the battle was over, but the fight for faith and understanding still continued. He had faced his own demons and discovered an inner strength he never knew he possessed. If you like this exciting narrative and want to follow more intriguing stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your subscription and support are very important so that we can continue to bring you fascinating and engaging content. Until next time.